My Thomas Story Library, Thomas. This is a story about Thomas the Tank Engine. Thomas worked really hard shunting coaches for the big engines, but what he wanted more than anything was his very own branch line. Thomas the Tank Engine had 6 small wheels, a short stumpy funnel, a short stumpy boiler, and a short stumpy dome. He was a fussy little engine, always pulling coaches about. He pulled them to the station, ready for the big engines to take out on journeys. And when trains came in, he pulled the empty coaches away so that the big engines could have a rest. But what Thomas really wanted was his very own branch line. That way, he would be a really useful engine. Thomas was a cheeky little engine. He thought no engine worked as hard as he did, and he liked playing tricks on the others. One day, Gordon had just returned from pulling the big express. He was very tired and had just gone to sleep when Thomas came up beside him. "Wake up, lazy bones!" whistled Thomas. "Do some hard work for a change!" And he ran off laughing. Gordon got a terrible shock. He decided he had to pay Thomas back. The next morning, Thomas wouldn't wake up. His driver and fireman couldn't make him start. It was nearly time for Gordon's express to leave. Gordon was waiting, but Thomas hadn't got his coaches ready. At last, Thomas started. "Oh dear," he yawned. "Poop, poop, poop! Hurry up, you!" said Gordon crossly. "Peep, peep, peep! Hurry up yourself!" replied Thomas cheekily. Thomas usually pushed behind Gordon's train to help him start, but he was always uncoupled first, so that when the train was running nicely, Thomas could stop and go back. That morning, Gordon saw the perfect chance to pay Thomas back for giving him a fright. He started so quickly that the guards forgot to uncouple Thomas. Gordon moved slowly out of the station, pulling the train and Thomas with him. Then he started to go faster and faster, much too fast for Thomas. "Peep, peep! Stop, stop!" whistled Thomas. "Hurry, hurry, hurry, hurry!" laughed Gordon in front. "You can't get away, you can't get away!" giggled the coaches. Poor Thomas was going faster than he had ever gone before. "I shall never be the same again," he thought sadly. "My wheels will be quite worn out." At last, they stopped at a station. Thomas was uncoupled and given a long, long drink. "Well, little Thomas," chuckled Gordon, "now you know what hard work means, don't you?" Poor Thomas was too breathless to answer. The next day, Thomas was working in the yard. On a siding by themselves were some strange-looking trucks. "That's the breakdown train," said his driver. "When there's an accident, the workmen use it to help clear and mend the line." Just then, James came whistling through the yard, crying, "Help! Help!" His brake blocks were on fire, and his trucks were pushing him faster and faster. James disappeared into the distance. Soon after, a bell rang in the signal box, and a man came running. "James is off the line! We need the breakdown train! Quickly!" he shouted. Thomas was coupled onto the breakdown train, and off he went as fast as he could. "Bother those trucks and their tricks," he said. "I hope James isn't hurt." They found James and the trucks at a bend in the line. James was in a field with a cow staring at him. The brake van and the last few trucks were still on the rails, but the front ones were piled in a heap behind James. James's driver and fireman were checking to see if he was hurt. "Don't worry, James," his driver said. "It wasn't your fault. It was those troublesome trucks." Thomas pushed the breakdown train alongside James, then he pulled the trucks that were still on the line out of the way. "Oh dear! Oh dear!" they groaned. "Serves you right! Serves you right!" puffed Thomas crossly. As soon as the other trucks were back on the line, Thomas pulled them away too. He was hard at work all afternoon. Using 2 cranes, the men put James carefully back on the rails. He tried to move, but he couldn't, so Thomas pulled him back to the shed. The Fat Controller was waiting for them there. "Well, Thomas," he said kindly, "I've heard all about it, and I think you're a really useful engine. I'm so pleased with you that I'm going to give you your own branch line." "Oh, thank you, sir," said Thomas happily. Now Thomas is as content as can be. He has a branch line all to himself, and he puffs proudly backwards and forwards from morning till night with his coaches, Annie and Clarabelle. Edward and Henry stop quite often at the junction to talk to him. Gordon is always in a hurry and does not stop, but he never forgets to say "poop, poop, poop" to Thomas, and Thomas always whistles "peep, peep, peep" in return. My Thomas Story Library, James. This is a story about James the Red Engine. When he first arrived on Sodor, he was so busy thinking about a shiny red paint that he soon got into lots of trouble. I thought I might have to send him away. James was a new engine with a shining coat of red paint. He had 2 small wheels in front and 6 driving wheels behind. They were smaller than Gordon's, but bigger than Thomas's. "You're a special mixed traffic engine," the Fat Controller told James. "That means you can pull either coaches or trucks." James felt very proud. The Fat Controller told James that today he was to help Edward pull coaches. "You need to be careful with coaches," said Edward. "They don't like getting bumped. If you bump them, they'll get cross." But James was thinking about a shiny red paint and wasn't really listening. James and Edward took the coaches to the platform. A group of boys came over to admire James. "I really am a splendid engine," thought James, and he let out a great whoosh of steam. Everyone jumped, and a shower of water fell on the Fat Controller, soaking his brand new top hat. James thought he had better leave quickly before he got into trouble, so he pulled away from the platform. "Slow down!" puffed Edward, who didn't like starting quickly. "You're going too fast! You're going too fast!" grumbled the coaches. When James reached the next station, he shot past the platform. His driver had to back up so the passengers could get off the train. "The Fat Controller won't be pleased when he hears about this," his driver said. James and Edward set off again and started to climb a hill. "It's ever so steep, it's ever so steep," puffed James. At last, they got to the top and pulled into the next station. James was panting so much that he got hiccups and frightened an old lady who dropped all her parcels. "Oh dear, the Fat Controller will be even crosser now," thought James. The next morning, the Fat Controller spoke to James very sternly. "If you don't learn to behave better, I shall take away your red paint and paint you blue," he warned. "Now run along and fetch your coaches." James felt cross. "A splendid red engine like me shouldn't have to fetch his own coaches," he muttered. "I'll show them how to pull coaches," he said to himself, and he set off at top speed. The coaches groaned and protested as they bumped along, but James wouldn't slow down. At last, The coaches had had enough. "We're going to stop! We're going to stop!" they cried, and try as he might, James found himself going slower and slower. The driver halted the train and got out. "There's a leak in the pipe," he said. "You are bumping the coaches hard enough to make a leak in anything." The guard made all the passengers get out of the train. "You, sir, please give me your bootlace," he said to one of them. "No, I shan't," said the passenger. Well then, we shall just have to stop where we are," said the guard. So the man agreed to give his bootlace to the guard. The guard used the lace to tie a pad of newspapers round the hole to stop the leak. Now James was able to pull the train again, but he knew he was going to be in real trouble with the Fat Controller this time. When James got back, the Fat Controller was very angry with him indeed. For the next few days, James was left alone in the shed. In disgrace. He wasn't even allowed to pull coaches and trucks in the yard. He felt really sad. Then one morning, the Fat Controller came to see him. "I see you are sorry," he said to James, "so I'd like you to pull some trucks for me." "Thank you, sir," said James, and he puffed happily away. "Here are your trucks, James," said a little engine. "Have you got some bootlaces ready?" And he chuffed off, laughing rudely. "Ow! Ow! Ow!" said the trucks as James backed down on them. "We want a proper engine, not a red monster!" James took no notice, but pulled the screeching trucks out of the yard. James started to heave the trucks up the hill, puffing and panting. But halfway up, the last 10 trucks broke away and rolled back down again. James's driver shut off steam. "We'll have to go back and get them," he said to James. James backed carefully down the hill to collect the trucks. Then with a peep peep, he was off again. "I can do it! I can do it!" he puffed. Then, "I've done it! I've done it!" he panted as he climbed over the top. When James got back to the station, the Fat Controller was very pleased with him. "You've made the most troublesome trucks on the line behave," he said. "After that, you deserve to keep your red paint." James was really happy. He knew he was going to enjoy working on the Fat Controller's railway. My Thomas Story Library, Donald and Douglas. This is a story about the twin Scottish engines, Donald and Douglas. They both came to work at my station, but I only needed one of them. The question was, which one should I keep? The Fat Controller's railway was busier than ever. All the engines had to work very hard indeed. "We don't know whether we're coming or going," grumbled Henry. "I know you are working very hard," said the Fat Controller, "so I have arranged for a new engine for goods work to come from Scotland tomorrow." But the next day, the Fat Controller got a surprise. Not one, but 2 engines arrived from Scotland. They were twins, called Donald and Douglas, and they had lost their numbers. No one knew which of them was supposed to stay. "One of you will have to go back to Scotland," said the Fat Controller. "I will paint numbers on you for now, but I will decide which is the better engine and send the other one home." So the engines were given new numbers. Donald was number 9 and Douglas was number 10. Donald and Douglas felt miserable. Neither of them wanted to stay without the other. "We'll just have to be so well behaved that you'll want to keep us both," said Douglas. "Aye," said Donald. "He won't be able to choose between us." The twins enjoyed working on the Fat Controller's railway. They were good at keeping the trucks in order, and they soon made friends with the other engines. Every day, Gordon's express train steamed in with a special coach for passengers travelling on Thomas's branch line. Duck had to remember to shunt the special coach for Thomas to pick up. Douglas said to Duck, "Why don't I move the special coach tomorrow?" "That would be very kind, Douglas," said Duck gratefully. The next day, when Gordon arrived with the special coach, Douglas was busy worrying about being sent back to Scotland. "I couldn't abide going back alone," said Douglas to himself. He was so worried that he forgot to take the special coach to Thomas. He pushed it into the siding and went to join Donald. When Thomas came along, he couldn't find his coach. A group of angry passengers complained to the Fat Controller. The Fat Controller went to find Douglas. I'm very annoyed, Douglas," he said. It looks as though you may be going back to Scotland." Next day, Douglas was extra careful and he didn't do anything wrong. But Donald was unlucky. He backed into a siding where the rails were slippery. Poor Donald couldn't stop. He crashed through the buffers and into a signal box, leaving the signalman sitting on the coal in the tender. "You clumsy great engine!" cried the signalman. "You've jammed my points!" The Fat Controller was very annoyed. "I'm disappointed in you, Donald," he said. "I was going to send Douglas back and keep you, but now I'm not so sure." Donald felt very sorry. That night, snow came to the island and covered all the tracks. Most engines hate snow, but Donald and Douglas loved it. They knew just what to do. They puffed busily backwards and forwards, patrolling the line. They even rescued other engines who got stuck in the snowdrifts. All the other engines liked Donald and Douglas. Everyone was sad that one of them was going to be sent away. "They were wonderful in the snow," said Henry. "What we need is a deputation," said Edward. "What is a depot station?" asked Henry. "A deputation is when engines tell the Fat Controller that something is wrong and ask him to put it right," replied Edward. "I propose," said Gordon quickly, "that Percy be our desperation." So it was Percy's job to speak to the Fat Controller. He wished it wasn't. "Please, sir, they made me a disputation," said Percy. "To speak to you, sir." "Do you mean a deputation?" asked the Fat Controller. "Yes, sir. It's Donald and Douglas, sir. Please don't send them away, sir. They're nice engines, sir." The Fat Controller smiled. The next day, the Fat Controller went to see Donald and Douglas. I hear you have been doing good work in the snow. What colour paint would you like?" The twin engines stared at him. "Blue, please, sir," they said in surprise. "Does that mean we'll both be staying, sir?" asked Donald. "It certainly does," said the Fat Controller. But the rest of his speech was drowned in a delighted chorus of cheers and whistles. My Thomas Story Library, Toby. This is a story about Toby the tram engine. Toby loved people, but everyone thought he was too old-fashioned. He felt very sad until one day someone came to his rescue. Toby was a tram engine. He had cowcatchers and side plates and a coach called Henrietta. Toby loved people, and was always happy when he could help them out. He was such a cheerful engine that people liked to help him too. Toby and Henrietta worked on a little line near a holiday town. They worked very hard, taking trucks from the farms to the main line, but they had very few passengers. "It's not fair," grumbled Henrietta one day. "The buses are always full of passengers, even though they often have accidents. We never have accidents, but I have hardly any passengers." "We can't understand it," said Toby, feeling sad. Sometimes the people on the buses laughed at Toby and called him old-fashioned. This made Toby cross. One day, a car stopped nearby and two children jumped out. Come and look at this engine," called a little boy. A nice-looking stout gentleman followed them with two ladies. "That's a tram engine," explained the stout gentleman. "It's a special kind of steam train." "Can we have a ride in it?" asked the little girl. They all climbed into Henrietta, and the guard blew his whistle. Toby set off, feeling proud to have passengers. "Hip, hip, hooray!" sang Henrietta as she rattled along. The stout gentleman and his family enjoyed their ride. "Thank you, Toby," they said. "Peep, peep," whistled Toby in reply. "Come again soon." "We will," called the family, and they waved goodbye. As time passed, Toby and Henrietta had fewer and fewer trucks to take to the main line, and they had no passengers at all. One morning, the driver looked very sad. "It's our last day, Toby," he said. "The manager says we must close tomorrow." At the end of the day, Toby puffed slowly to his shed. "Nobody wants me," he said unhappily. But the next morning, Toby had a big surprise. A letter had arrived for his driver. "It's from the stout gentleman," said the driver. "Do you remember him, Toby?" "I remember him very well," said Toby. "He knew how to speak to engines." "No wonder," said his driver. "That gentleman was the Fat Controller." The Fat Controller needed extra help on his railway, and he had thought of the nice little engine he met on holiday. Toby could hardly believe it. Toby and Henrietta set off that day. They were very excited. When they arrived at Tidmouth Sheds, the Fat Controller came to meet them. "Thank you very much for asking me to come, sir," said Toby. "I'm glad you're here, Toby," said the Fat Controller. "I hope you will work hard and be a useful engine just like Thomas." "I'll try, sir," said Toby. Thomas came up to say hello. He showed Toby what to do, and they were soon very good friends. Toby loved working on the Fat Controller's railway, and he soon learned to be a really useful engine. Next to Thomas's branch line was a little cottage. The lady who lived there liked to see Toby and Thomas puffing past. She always waved to them from her window. "That is Mrs. Kindly," Thomas told Toby. "She isn't very well, and she has to stay in bed all day." "Poor lady," said Toby. "I wish we could help her." From then on, Toby and Thomas always whistled to Mrs. Kindly when they passed her cottage. One day, it was raining hard as Thomas hurried along the track with Toby following behind. Suddenly, Thomas's driver pointed at Mrs. Kindly's cottage. "Something's wrong," he said. A big red cloth was waving out of the cottage window. "Perhaps Mrs. Kindly needs help," said Thomas's fireman. Thomas stopped carefully just before a bend in the track. Thomas's driver and fireman hurried to the cottage, but when they looked around the bend in the track, they understood why Mrs. Kindly had stopped them. "A landslide," said the driver. "Mrs. Kindly has saved our lives." Mrs. Kindly had seen the landslide and had waved her red dressing gown out of the window to warn the engines. The line was cleared the next day, and a very special train puffed along the branch line towards Mrs. Kindly's cottage. First came Toby, then Thomas with Annie and Clarabel, and last of all came Henrietta. The Fat Controller was there too. Everyone wanted to say thank you to Mrs. Kindly. When they reached the bend in the track, they stopped. The people got out and climbed up to the cottage. Toby and Thomas wished they could go too. Thomas's driver gave Mrs. Kindly a new dressing gown. The guard gave her some grapes, and Toby and Thomas sent some coal as a present. The engines and I would like to give you these tickets for a trip to the seaside, said the Fat Controller. We hope you will get better in the sunshine. You are very kind, said Mrs. Kindly. Toby and Thomas blew their whistles to say thank you. Toby felt very happy that he had come to work on the Fat Controller's railway. Hip hip hooray! Sang Henrietta. My Thomas Story Library, Bulgy. This is a story about Bulgy the bus. He came to work on the island of Sodor during the busy season. He thought he was better than all the engines, so he tried to take their passengers away. It was the sightseeing season on the island of Sodor. The Fat Controller's engines were working hard. Their station was crowded with people. Duck, Donald and Douglas were taking passengers from the station to other parts of the island. Some passengers have been brought to Sodor by a big red bus called Bulgy. Bulgy looked at the crowded platform and frowned. I wouldn't have brought more passengers if I'd known how many were here already, he said. But they are all really enjoying themselves, said Duck. Pah! Replied Bulgy crossly. Duck thought Bulgy was very moody. Bulgy was rude to all the engines. Every time he saw them, he shouted, Down with the railways! He said railways should be closed so coaches, buses and cars could do everything instead. The engines thought Bulgy was rather silly, but when another bus arrived to take Bulgy's passengers home, the engines were worried. This meant Bulgy was going to stay on the island. Would he really get the railway closed down? What would the engines do then? Bulgy told the passengers that he could get them to the big station faster than the engines could. That's rubbish, said Duck. It's much further by road. Yes, said Oliver, but Bulgy says he knows a shortcut. That evening, Duck was about to start his final journey of the day, but he only had a few passengers aboard. He waited for a few minutes, hoping more would turn up, but none did. Just then, Duck heard a loud toot toot. Bulgy was leaving the station. He had a sign on his side saying railway bus. Most of Duck's passengers had gone with Bulgy because he had told them he was working for the railway. Stop! Called the railway staff as Bulgy pulled away, but it was too late. Yaboo snobs! Bulgy said as he roared away with the passengers. Duck and his carriages, Alice and Mirabel, set off on their journey with the few passengers they had. Bulgy is a nasty old thief, said Alice to Mirabel. He's taken our people. Duck knew they had to stop Bulgy taking their passengers. If it carried on like this, the railway could be shut down. He wondered what they should do. But Bulgy was about to be stopped. His shortcut led down a narrow road with a low bridge. As he rushed under the bridge, there was a sudden screeching noise and he ground to a halt. He tried to move forwards, and he tried to move backwards, but it was no good. He was totally stuck. Cars and coaches beeped angrily at Bulgy because he was blocking the road. "A tour bus like you should never have gone down this road," they said. Bulgy's passengers were furious. "We should have gone with Duck," they said. He would never have let us down like this. We're going to miss our train at the big station, and it's all your fault," they shouted at Bulgy. Bulgy didn't say a word. As Duck reached the bridge, a man appeared by the track, waving a red warning flag. "Danger!" he cried. A bus is stuck under the bridge." Duck moved slowly forward. He saw Bulgy under the bridge. "So, that is Bulgy's so-called shortcut," he laughed. Bulgy held his breath as Duck slowly moved over the bridge. "The bus tricked us," said Bulgy's passengers. "He said he was working for the railway, but he lied. Can we go with you instead?" Duck agreed and took all the passengers to the big station in time for their train. The passengers promised they would always travel by train from then on. Bulgy was left under the bridge. He had to wait all night before he was rescued. He didn't learn his lesson though. He still thought he could take over the railway. But by then, everyone knew that it was faster to go by train, so they all travelled with the engines instead. Bulgy decided to retire. He asked the farmer if he could live in his field and look after his hens. The farmer agreed. From that day on, Bulgy was much happier. The hens enjoyed hearing about his grand adventures on the bus route and how terrible engines were. They didn't know any better, and Bulgy felt proud because the hens produced more eggs than ever before.